Post-Reform Russian, Idiot, Romanized, Idiot is a novel by the 19th-century Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. It was first published serially in the journal The Russian Messenger in 1868–69. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, 8 UK, Dostoevsky 1 US, Dostoyevsky. Ds 2. Russian. Fedor Mihailovich. Dostoevsky b Romanized. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, IPA. Efter Mxlv Dsenjevsky I, 11 November 1821 to 9 February 1881, 3 seat sometimes transliterated as Dostoevsky, was a Russian novelist, short story writer, essayist and journalist. Numerous literary critics regard him as one of the greatest and finest novelists in all of world literature, for as many of his works are considered highly influential masterpieces. 5–6 Dostoevsky's literary works explore the human condition in the troubled political, social, and spiritual atmospheres of 19th-century Russia, and engage with a variety of philosophical and religious themes. His most acclaimed novels include Crime and Punishment 1866, The Idiot 1869, Demons 1872, and The Brothers Karamazov 1880. His 1864 novella Notes from Underground is considered to be one of the first works of existentialist literature. Born in Moscow in 1821, Dostoevsky was introduced to literature at an early age through fairy tales and legends, and through books by Russian and foreign authors. His mother died in 1837 when he was 15, and around the same time, he left school to enter the Nikolaev Military Engineering Institute. After graduating, he worked as an engineer and briefly enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, translating books to earn extra money. In the mid-1840s he wrote his first novel, Poor Folk, which gained him entry into St. Petersburg's literary circles. However, he was arrested in 1849 for belonging to a literary group, the Petrashevsky Circle, that discussed banned books critical of Tsarist Russia. Dostoevsky was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted at the last moment. He spent 4 years in a Siberian prison camp, followed by 6 years of compulsory military service in exile. In the following years, Dostoevsky worked as a journalist, publishing and editing several magazines of his own and later a writer's diary, a collection of his writings. He began to travel around Western Europe and developed a gambling addiction, which led to financial hardship. For a time, he had to beg for money, but he eventually became one of the most widely read and highly regarded Russian writers. Dostoevsky's body of work consists of 13 novels, 3 novellas, 17 short stories, and numerous other works. His writings were widely read both within and beyond his native Russia and influenced an equally great number of later writers including Russians such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Anton Chekhov, philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and the emergence of existentialism and Freudianism. 3. His books have been translated into more than 170 languages, and served as the inspiration for many films. The title is an ironic reference to the central character of the novel. Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin, a young prince whose goodness, open-hearted simplicity, and guilelessness led many of the more worldly characters he encounters to mistakenly assume that he lacks intelligence and insight. In the character of Prince Myshkin, Dostoevsky set himself the task of depicting the positively good and beautiful man. 1. The novel examines the consequences of placing such a singular individual at the center of the conflicts, desires, passions, and egoism of worldly society, both for the man himself and for those with whom he becomes involved. Joseph Frank describes The Idiot as the most personal of all Dostoevsky's major works, the book in which he embodies his most intimate, cherished, and sacred convictions. 2. It includes descriptions of some of his most intense personal ordeals, such as epilepsy and mock execution, and explores moral, spiritual, and philosophical themes consequent upon them. His primary motivation in writing the novel was to subject his own highest ideal, that of true Christian love, to the crucible of contemporary Russian society. The artistic method of conscientiously testing his central idea meant that the author could not always predict where the plot was going as he was writing. The novel has an awkward structure, and many critics have commented on its seemingly chaotic organization. According to Gary Saul Morson, The Idiot violates every critical norm and yet somehow manages to achieve real greatness. 3. Dostoevsky himself was of the opinion that the experiment was not entirely successful, but the novel remained his favorite among his works. In a letter to Strakov he wrote, "Much in the novel was written hurriedly, much is too diffuse and did not turn out well, but some of it did turn out well. I do not stand behind the novel, but I do stand behind the idea." 4. Background. Edit. In September 1867, when Dostoevsky began work on what was to become The Idiot, he was living in Switzerland with his new wife Anna Grigorievna, having left Russia in order to escape his creditors. They were living in extreme poverty, and constantly had to borrow money or pawn their possessions. They were evicted from their lodgings 5 times for non-payment of rent, and by the time the novel was finished in January 1869 they had moved between 4 different cities in Switzerland and Italy. During this time Dostoevsky periodically fell into the grip of his gambling addiction and lost what little money they had on the roulette tables. He was subject to regular and severe epileptic seizures, including one while Anna was going into labor with their daughter Sophia, delaying their ability to go for a midwife. The baby died aged only 3 months, and Dostoevsky blamed himself for the loss. 5. Dostoevsky's notebooks of 1867 reveal deep uncertainty as to the direction he was taking with the novel. Detailed plot outlines and character sketches were made, but were quickly abandoned and replaced with new ones. In one early draft, the character who was to become Prince Myshkin is an evil man who commits a series of terrible crimes, including the rape of his adopted sister Nastasia Filipovna, and who only arrives at goodness by way of his conversion through Christ. By the end of the year, however, a new premise had been firmly adopted. In a letter to Apollon Makov, Dostoevsky explained that his own desperate circumstances had forced him to seize on an idea that he had considered for some time but had been afraid of, feeling himself to be artistically unready for it. This was the idea to depict a completely beautiful human being. 6. Rather than bring a man to goodness, he wanted to start with a man who was already a truly Christian soul, someone who was essentially innocent and deeply compassionate, and test him against the psychological, social and political complexities of the modern Russian world. It was not only a matter of how the good man responded to that world, but of how it responded to him. Devising a series of scandalous scenes, he would examine each character's emotions and record what each would do in response to Myshkin and to the other characters. 7. The difficulty with this approach was that he himself did not know in advance how the characters were going to respond, and thus he was unable to pre-plan the plot or structure of the novel. Nonetheless, in January 1868 the first chapters of The Idiot were sent off to the Russian messenger. Plot. Edit. Part 1. Prince Myshkin, a young man in his mid-20s and a descendant of one of the oldest Russian lines of nobility, is on a train to St. Petersburg on a cold November morning. He is returning to Russia having spent the past 4 years in a Swiss clinic for treatment of a severe epileptic condition. On the journey, Myshkin meets a young man of the merchant class, Parfen Semyonovich Rogozhin, and is struck by his passionate intensity, particularly in relation to a woman, the dazzling society beauty Nastasia Filipovna Barashkova, with whom he is obsessed. Rogozhin has just inherited a very large fortune due to the death of his father, and he intends to use it to pursue the object of his desire. Joining in their conversation is a civil servant named Lebedev, a man with a profound knowledge of social trivia and gossip. Realizing who Rogozhin is, Lebedev firmly attaches himself to him. The purpose of Myshkin's trip is to make the acquaintance of his distant relative Lizaveta Prokofievna, and to make inquiries about a matter of business. Lizaveta Prokofievna is the wife of General Apanchin, a wealthy and respected man in his mid-50s. When the prince calls on them he meets Gavril Ardalionovich Ivolgin, Ganya the general's assistant. The general and his business partner, the aristocrat Totsky, are seeking to arrange a marriage between Ganya and Nastasia Filipovna. Totsky had been the orphaned Nastasia Filipovna's childhood guardian, but he had taken advantage of his position to groom her for his own sexual gratification. As a grown woman, Nastasia Filipovna has developed an incisive and merciless insight into their relationship. Totsky, thinking the marriage might settle her and free him to pursue his desire for marriage with General Apanchin's eldest daughter, has promised 75,000 rubles. Nastasia Filipovna, suspicious of Ganya and aware that his family does not approve of her, has reserved her decision, but has promised to announce it that evening at her birthday soiree. Ganya and the general openly discuss the subject in front of Myshkin. Ganya shows him a photograph of her, and he is particularly struck by the dark beauty of her face. Myshkin makes the acquaintance of Lizaveta Prokofievna and her 3 daughters, Alexandra, Adelaida and Aglaya. They are all very curious about him and not shy about expressing their opinion, particularly Aglaya. He readily engages with them and speaks with remarkable candor on a wide variety of subjects: his illness, his impressions of Switzerland, art, philosophy, love, death, the brevity of life, capital punishment, and donkeys. In response to their request that he speak of the time he was in love, he tells a long anecdote from his time in Switzerland about a downtrodden woman, Marie, whom he befriended, along with a group of children, when she was unjustly ostracized and morally condemned. The prince ends by describing what he divines about each of their characters from studying their faces and surprises them by saying that Aglaia is almost as beautiful as Nastasia Philippovna. The prince rents a room in the Ivolgin apartment, occupied by Ganya's family and another lodger called Ferdishenko. There is much angst within Ganya's family about the proposed marriage, which is regarded, particularly by his mother and sister, Varya, as shameful. Just as a quarrel on the subject is reaching a peak of tension, Nastasia Philippovna herself arrives to pay a visit to her potential new family. Shocked and embarrassed, Ganya succeeds in introducing her, but when she bursts into a prolonged fit of laughter at the look on his face, his expression transforms into one of murderous hatred. The prince intervenes to calm him down, and Ganya's rage is diverted toward him in a violent gesture. The tension is not eased by the entrance of Ganya's father, General Ivolgin, a drunkard with a tendency to tell elaborate lies. Nastasia Philippovna flirtatiously encourages the general and then mocks him. Ganya's humiliation is compounded by the arrival of Rogozhin, accompanied by a rowdy crowd of drunks and rogues, Lebedev among them. Rogozhin openly starts bidding for Nastasia Philippovna, ending with an offer of 100,000 rubles. With the scene assuming increasingly scandalous proportions, Varya angrily demands that someone remove the shameless woman. Ganya seizes his sister's arm, and she responds, to Nastasia Philippovna's delight, by spitting in his face. He is about to strike her when the prince again intervenes, and Ganya slaps him violently in the face. Everyone is deeply shocked, including Nastasia Philippovna, and she struggles to maintain her mocking aloofness as the others seek to comfort the prince. Myshkin admonishes her and tells her it is not who she really is. She apologizes to Ganya's mother and leaves, telling Ganya to be sure to come to her birthday party that evening. Rogozhin and his retinue go off to raise the 100,000 rubles. Among the guests at the party are Totsky, General Apanchin, Ganya, his friend Titsin, Varya's fiancé, and Ferdishenko, who, with Nastasia Philippovna's approval, plays the role of cynical buffoon. With the help of Ganya's younger brother Kolya, the prince arrives, uninvited. To enliven the party, Ferdishenko suggests a game where everyone must recount the story of the worst thing they have ever done. Others are shocked at the proposal, but Nastasia Philippovna is enthusiastic. When it comes to Totsky's turn, he tells a long but innocuous anecdote from the distant past. Disgusted, Nastasia Philippovna turns to Myshkin and demands his advice on whether or not to marry Ganya. Myshkin advises her not to, and Nastasia Philippovna, to the dismay of Totsky, General Apanchin and Ganya, firmly announces that she is following this advice. At this point, Rogozhin and his followers arrive with the promised 100,000 rubles. Nastasia Philippovna is preparing to leave with him, exploiting the scandalous scene to humiliate Totsky, when Myshkin himself offers to marry her. He speaks gently and sincerely, and in response to incredulous queries about what they will live on, produces a document indicating that he will soon be receiving a large inheritance. Though surprised and deeply touched, Nastasia Philippovna, after throwing the 100,000 rubles in the fire and telling Ganya they are his if he wants to get them out, chooses to leave with Rogozhin. Myshkin follows them. Part 2. For the next 6 months, Nastasia Philippovna remains unsettled and is torn between Myshkin and Rogozhin. Myshkin is tormented by her suffering, and Rogozhin is tormented by her love for Myshkin and her disdain for his own claims on her. Returning to Petersburg, the prince visits Rogozhin's house. Myshkin becomes increasingly horrified at Rogozhin's attitude to her. Rogozhin confesses to beating her in a jealous rage and raises the possibility of cutting her throat. Despite the tension between them, they part as friends, with Rogozhin even making a gesture of concession. But the prince remains troubled and for the next few hours he wanders the streets, immersed in intense contemplation. He suspects that Rogozhin is watching him and returns to his hotel where Rogozhin, who has been hiding in the stairway, attacks him with a knife. At the same moment, the prince is struck down by a violent epileptic seizure, and Rogozhin flees in a panic. Recovering, Myshkin joins Lebedev, from whom he is renting a dacha, in the summer resort town Pavlovsk. He knows that Nastasia Philippovna is in Pavlovsk and that Lebedev is aware of her movements and plans. The Apanchins, who are also in Pavlovsk, visit the prince. They are joined by their friend Yevgeny Pavlovich Radomsky, a handsome and wealthy military officer. With a particular interest in Aglaia. Aglaia, however, is more interested in the prince, and to Myshkin's embarrassment and everyone else's amusement, she recites Pushkin's poem, The Poor Knight, in a reference to his noble efforts to save Nastasia Philipovna. The Epanchin's visit is rudely interrupted by the arrival of Burdovsky, a young man who claims to be the illegitimate son of Myshkin's late benefactor, Pavlishev. The inarticulate Burdovsky is supported by a group of insolent young men. These include the consumptive 17-year-old Ippolit Terentiev, the nihilist Doktorenko, and Keller, an ex-officer who, with the help of Lebedev, has written an article vilifying the prince and Pavlishev. They demand money from Myshkin as a just reimbursement for Pavlishev's support, but their arrogant bravado is severely dented when Gavril Ardalyanovich, who has been researching the matter on Myshkin's behalf, proves conclusively that the claim is false and that Burdovsky has been deceived. The prince tries to reconcile with the young men and offers financial support anyway. Disgusted, Lizaveta Prokofievna loses all control and furiously attacks both parties. Ippolit laughs, and Lizaveta Prokofievna seizes him by the arm, causing him to break into a prolonged fit of coughing. But he suddenly becomes calm, informs them all that he is near death, and politely requests that he be permitted to talk to them for a while. He awkwardly attempts to express his need for their love, eventually bringing both himself and Lizaveta Prokofievna to the point of tears. But as the prince and Lizaveta Prokofievna discuss what to do with the invalid, another transformation occurs in Ippolit, after unleashing a torrent of abuse at the prince, leaves with the other young men. The Epanchins also leave, both Lizaveta Prokofievna and Aglaya deeply indignant with the prince. Only Yevgeny Pavlovich remains in good spirits, and he smiles charmingly as he says goodbye. At that moment, a magnificent carriage pulls up at the dacha, and the ringing voice of Nastasia Philipovna calls out to Yevgeny Pavlovich. In a familiar tone, she tells him not to worry about all the IOUs as Rogozhin has bought them up. The carriage departs, leaving everyone, particularly Yevgeny Pavlovich and the prince, in a state of shock. Yevgeny Pavlovich claims to know nothing about the debts, and Nastasia Philipovna's motives become a subject of anxious speculation. Part 3. Only Vera, Kolya, Burdovsky, and Keller seek to restrain him. He distracts them by pretending to abandon the plan, then suddenly pulls out a small pistol, puts it to his temple and pulls the trigger. There is a click but no shot. Ippolit faints but is not killed. It turns out that he had taken out the cap earlier and forgotten to put it back in. Ippolit is devastated and tries desperately to convince everyone that it was an accident. Eventually he falls asleep and the party disperses. The prince wanders for some time in the park before falling asleep at the green seat appointed by Aglaya as their meeting place. Her laughter wakes him from an unhappy dream about Nastasia Philipovna. They talk for a long time about the letters Aglaya has received, in which Nastasia Philipovna writes that she herself is in love with Aglaya and passionately beseeches her to marry Myshkin. Aglaya interprets this as evidence that Nastasia Philipovna is in love with him herself, and demands that Myshkin explain his feelings toward her. Myshkin replies that Nastasia Philipovna is insane, that he only feels profound compassion and is not in love with her, but admits that he has come to Pavlovsk for her sake. Aglaya becomes angry, demands that he throw the letters back in her face, and storms off. Myshkin reads the letters with dread, and later that day Nastasia Philipovna herself appears to him, asking desperately if he is happy, and telling him she is going away and will not write any more letters. Rogozhin escorts her. Part 4. It is clear to Lizaveta Prokofievna and General Epanchin that their daughter is in love with the prince, but Aglaya denies this and angrily dismisses talk of marriage. She continues to mock and reproach him, often in front of others, and lets slip that, as far as she is concerned, the problem of Nastasia Philipovna is yet to be resolved. Myshkin himself merely experiences an uncomplicated joy in her presence and is mortified when she appears to be angry with him. Lizaveta Prokofievna feels it is time to introduce the prince to their aristocratic circle, and a dinner party is arranged for this purpose, to be attended by a number of eminent persons. Aglaya, who does not share her parents' respect for these people, and is afraid that Myshkin's eccentricity will not meet with their approval, tries to tell him how to behave, but ends by sarcastically telling him to be as eccentric as he likes, and to be sure to wave his arms about when he is pontificating on some high-minded subject and break her mother's priceless Chinese vase. Feeling her anxiety, Myshkin too becomes extremely anxious, but he tells her that it is nothing compared to the joy he feels in her company. He tries to approach the subject of Nastasia Philipovna again, but she silences him and hurriedly leaves. For a while the dinner party proceeds smoothly. Inexperienced in the ways of the aristocracy, Myshkin is deeply impressed by the elegance and good humor of the company, unsuspicious of its superficiality. It turns out that one of those present, Ivan Petrovich, is a relative of his beloved benefactor Pavlushev, and the prince becomes extraordinarily enthusiastic. But when Ivan Petrovich mentions that Pavlushev ended by giving up everything and going over to the Catholic Church, Myshkin is horrified. He launches unexpectedly into an anti-Catholic tirade, claiming that it preaches the Antichrist and in its quest for political supremacy has given birth to atheism. Everyone present is shocked and several attempts are made to stop or divert him, but he only becomes more animated. At the height of his fervor he begins waving his arms about and knocks over the priceless Chinese vase, smashing it to pieces. As Myshkin emerges from his profound astonishment, the general horror turns to amusement and concern for his health. But it is only temporary, and he soon begins another spontaneous discourse, this time on the subject of the aristocracy in Russia, once again becoming oblivious to all attempts to quell his ardor. The speech is only brought to an end by the onset of an epileptic seizure. Aglaya, deeply distressed, catches him in her arms as he falls. He is taken home, having left a decidedly negative impression on the guests. The next day Ippolit visits the prince to inform him that he and others, such as Lebedev and Ganya, have been intriguing against him, and have been unsettling Aglaya with talk of Nastasia Filipovna. Ippolit has arranged, at Aglaya's request and with Rogozhin's help, a meeting between the two women. That evening Aglaya, having left her home in secret, calls for the prince. They proceed in silence to the appointed meeting place, where both Nastasia Filipovna and Rogozhin are already present. It soon becomes apparent that Aglaya has not come there to discuss anything, but to chastise and humiliate Nastasia Filipovna, and a bitter exchange of accusations and insults ensues. Nastasia Filipovna orders Rogozhin to leave and hysterically demands of Myshkin that he stay with her. Myshkin, once again torn by her suffering, is unable to deny her and reproaches Aglaya for her attack. Aglaya looks at him with pain and hatred, and runs off. He goes after her but Nastasia Filipovna stops him desperately and then faints. Myshkin stays with her. In accordance with Nastasia Filipovna's wish, she and the prince become engaged. Public opinion is highly critical of Myshkin's actions toward Aglaya, and the Epanchins break off all relations with him. He tries to explain to Yevgeny Pavlovich that Nastasia Filipovna is a broken soul, that he must stay with her or she will probably die, and that Aglaya will understand if he is only allowed to talk to her. Yevgeny Pavlovich refuses to facilitate any contact between them and suspects that Myshkin himself is mad. On the day of the wedding, a beautifully attired Nastasia Filipovna is met by Keller and Burdovsky, who are to escort her to the church where Myshkin is waiting. A large crowd has gathered, among whom is Rogozhin. Seeing him, Nastasia Filipovna rushes to him and tells him hysterically to take her away, which Rogozhin loses no time in doing. The prince, though shaken, is not particularly surprised at this development. For the remainder of the day he calmly fulfills his social obligations to guests and members of the public. The following morning he takes the first train to Petersburg and goes to Rogozhin's house, but he is told by servants that there is no one there. After several hours of fruitless searching, he returns to the hotel he was staying at when he last encountered Rogozhin in Petersburg. Rogozhin appears and asks him to come back to the house. They enter the house in secret and Rogozhin leads him to the dead body of Nastasia Filipovna. He has stabbed her through the heart. The two men keep vigil over the body, which Rogozhin has laid out in his study. Rogozhin is sentenced to 15 years hard labor in Siberia. Myshkin goes mad and, through the efforts of Yevgeny Pavlovich, returns to the sanatorium in Switzerland. The Epanchins go abroad and Aglaya elopes with a wealthy, exiled Polish count who later is discovered to be neither wealthy, nor a count, nor an exile, at least, not a political exile, and who, along with a Catholic priest, has turned her against her family. Characters. Prince Myshkin, the novel's central character, is a young man who has returned to Russia after a long period abroad where he was receiving treatment for epilepsy. The lingering effects of the illness, combined with his innocence and lack of social experience, sometimes create the superficial and completely false impression of mental or psychological deficiency. Most of the other characters at one time or another refer to him disparagingly as an idiot, but nearly all of them are deeply affected by him. In truth, he is highly intelligent, self-aware, intuitive, and empathic. He is someone who has thought deeply about human nature, morality and spirituality, and is capable of expressing those thoughts with great clarity. Nastasia Filipovna, the main female protagonist, is darkly beautiful, intelligent, fierce, and mocking. She is an intimidating figure to most of the other characters. Of noble birth but orphaned at age 7, she was manipulated into a position of sexual servitude by her guardian, the voluptuary Dostoevsky. Her broken innocence and the social perception of disgrace produce an intensely emotional and destructive personality. The prince is deeply moved by her beauty and her suffering, and despite feeling that she is insane, remains devoted to her. She is torn between Myshkin's compassion and Rogozhin's obsession with her. Rogozhin Parfen Semyonovich, who has just inherited a huge fortune from his merchant father, is madly in love with Nastasia Filipovna and recklessly abandons himself to pursuing her. He instinctively likes and trusts the prince when they first meet, but later develops a hatred for him out of jealousy. The character represents passionate, instinctive love, as opposed to Myshkin's Christian love based in compassion. 8. Aglaya Ivanovna is the radiantly beautiful youngest daughter of Myshkin's distant relative Lizaveta Prokofievna and her husband, the wealthy and respected General Apanchin. Aglaya is proud, commanding, and impatient, but also full of arch humor, laughter, and innocence. The prince is particularly drawn to her after the darkness of his time with Nastasia Filipovna and Rogozhin. Ippolit Taraniev is a young nihilist intellectual who is in the final stages of tuberculosis and near death. Still full of youthful idealism, he craves love and recognition from others, but their indifference and his own morbid self-obsession lead him to increasing extremes of cynicism and defiance. The character is a quasi-double for Myshkin. Their circumstances force them to address the same metaphysical questions, but their responses are diametrically opposed. 9. Other characters. Edit. Ganyuk Gavril Ardalionovich, a capable but extremely vain and avaricious young man, he offers himself in marriage to Nastasia Filipovna, whom he secretly hates, on the promise of riches from Dostoevsky, but she rejects and humiliates him. He also tries to compete with Myshkin for Aglaya's affections. A mediocre man who is resentful of his own lack of originality, Ganya represents love from vanity, and is contrasted with Myshkin and Rogozhin. 10. Lebedyev Lukian Timofeyevich, a roguish drunkard whose restless curiosity and petty ambition have made him into a kind of repository of social information. He uses this to ingratiate himself with superiors, and to pursue various schemes and intrigues. His unpleasant tendencies are offset to some extent by a mischievous sense of humor, a sharp intellect, and occasional bouts of abject self-condemnation and compassion for others. Lizaveta Prokofievna, Aglaya's mother and Myshkin's distant relative. Though childlike in the spontaneity of her emotions, she is strong-willed and imperious, particularly about matters of honor and morality. Myshkin considers her and Aglaya to be very alike. General Ivan Fyodorovich Apanchin, Aglaya's father. Alexandra Ivanovna